Welcome to Piscicomao, David here, and if you've ever watched any of my advanced camera app reviews, you'll hear me going on and on and on about shooting in RAW. And the reason why it's such an essential part of my workflow and why it's so important to me is because it allows me to have the most control and get the most out of my iPhone's sensor. Often shooting in RAW can be quite frustrating because when you take the photo, the RAW file never actually looks like what you thought you were going to get. So today I'm going to share my workflow and my thought process. So if you want to get started shooting in RAW, here's how to do it and get past some of those frustrations and take the photos that you actually want. As you can't shoot in RAW with the iPhone's built-in camera app, the first thing you're going to need to do is invest in an advanced camera app. So I personally recommend these three, and I'll be using a selection of different apps throughout the video. And if you're not sure which one is right for you, then I have reviews, comprehensive reviews on all three of them down in the description. So you've got your advanced camera app, you're in RAW. Now what? Well, the first issue that you'll encounter with the RAW file is the one that I mentioned before. It's that you don't get a live preview when you're shooting. It might look like you do, but you don't. So it can be quite a shock and quite frustrating, like I said, when you think you're going to get one result and then the RAW file just looks completely different. And the reason this happens is because there's so much information in the RAW file. The iPhone sensor is just literally capturing the raw and unedited information like as much as it can, like hence the name RAW file. So there's just too much information for the iPhone to process in real time as you're moving the camera around when you're shooting. Now, of course, you don't get a live preview when you're shooting through a DSLR's viewfinder either, but this isn't usually a problem because DSLRs have light meters built in that you can use as a guide for your exposure. But you don't get this tool on apps with the iPhone, so you have to get information about your exposure elsewhere. And this is where the live histogram comes in. Think of the live histogram as your data and tonal viewfinder, as it breaks up the tones and the data in your image into different exposure ranges and displays them in real time like this. The leftmost side is the deepest blacks that gradually get lighter until we reach the shadows, then the midtones, the highlights, and then the whites. So the larger the area, the more data there is in that range. Just keep in mind that not all histograms will look the same and they're not all as detailed as this. Like, it's really nice to have like this one that looks like a mountain range in Pro Camera because, like I said, it is the most detailed. It's a really nice visualization of your exposure. But a lot of other advanced camera apps just display the histogram as lines. So the longer the lines, the more information there is in that range. So take a look at this screen recording here of me shooting in RAW. So RAW is turned on and the image looks nice and bright, but the histogram at the bottom is telling me that most of the tones in this image are coming from the shadows. You can see there's lots of information in there and hardly any highlights. Remember, we don't get a live preview when shooting in RAW, so when I take this image, you can see the histogram was right and the live preview, not so much. So now we know how to see where the tonal values and the data in your image are. Let's go about controlling them and getting the pictures that you want. Now, I found that auto exposure and RAW just don't go together and don't produce the results that I want. So I shoot exclusively with manual settings. And the first thing I always do when I'm shooting is I bring my ISO down to the lowest possible setting, which is 24 or 25. And I basically do this for image quality reasons. Like, the lower the ISO, the less noise is going to be in the image and the higher image quality I'm going to get. Because when it comes to image quality, especially with noise, like the iPhone's image sensor, as capable as it is, it's still tiny and it needs all the help it can get. Next, since there's no aperture control, like my iPhone XR's aperture is just fixed at f1.8, I turn to the shutter speed and I basically just manipulate and adjust the shutter speed until my histogram looks exactly how I want it to look. So in this situation, the trees and the path are the main focus of my photo. Now, the iPhone is making them look a lot brighter than they are in real life. Remember, do not trust the iPhone's viewfinder when you're shooting in RAW. Look at the histogram. And they're more in the shadow, lower mid-tone sort of area, so I want lots of information in those areas of the histogram. So I'm literally just adjusting my shutter speed until my histogram looks like I want it to look like. And this process doesn't take long. As you can see, I get there pretty much straight away. This might take you a little bit longer at first and with a lot more trial and error, but just keep in mind that I literally shoot in RAW every single day. So I know how the histogram should look in different lighting situations to produce the results that I want. And finally, I set the white balance. Now, it's tempting, especially when shooting in RAW, to leave the white balance in AWB or auto white balance because With RAW, the white balance isn't locked. You can change it later. And I think the reason why I do this is just out of habit, because when I'm shooting video, it's like imperative that I set the white balance before I start the recording, because I don't want the white balance to constantly change as I'm filming. And I think this is just carried over into shooting photos. So yeah, it's probably just a habit, but it's not a bad habit. And if you forget to set the white balance, like I said, it's not a big deal, because you can just change it while you're editing later. So in this situation in the forest, like I like warmer greens and warmer browns, so I usually set the white balance to about 6,000 to 7,000 Kelvin. Now some might say this is too dark, and they're probably right. You know, it is about one stop underexposed, but I actually underexpose my iPhone RAW files on purpose, because again, through constant repetition and constant shooting, I found what works best both for my iPhone and my own workflow. So now that our RAW file is captured, let's move on to the editing process. And this is where the work we put in while shooting pays off, because we'll have loads of data in all the right places to play with to finish creating the photo that we want. I'll show you how I edit my photos and give you some examples of how RAW files behave. And I've also made some of my own RAW files available for download, so you can follow along and practice. Again, I'll link to them in the description. Now, just like with taking RAW files, the iPhone can't display RAW files either. When you open a RAW file in the Photos app, it'll either be the JPEG version or a very low-res preview. So basically, you need to invest in an editing app as well. Snapseed is a popular free option, but if you want any sort of workflow whatsoever, then I really recommend looking into either Darkroom or Lightroom. So here is that image that we took before, this RAW file open in the Lightroom. So let's look what happens when we make some edits. So I want to start with the sliders. This is the typical method of editing. So if we bring the exposure all the way up, you can see the overall brightness of the picture is coming way up, and then we can bring it down and it goes way down. We can also edit the exposure using the tone curve. Now this tone curve is like a direct correlation with the histogram. So over here we have the brightest whites, the whites. We have the highlights, bring them up and down. We have the midtones, and then we have the shadows. You can see every time I touch the tone curve, it makes a point. So you can make some really funky shapes with the tone curve. You can basically do anything that you want to do. But let's do something a little bit more normal. Let's start by manipulating the shadows. You can see in the histogram, this image is pretty shadow heavy. So we can bring the shadows all the way up here. And you can see just by making one point, like the overall tone curve kind of changes shape. So what we can do is we can tap on the highlights, make a new point, and then just like bring the highlights down. That doesn't look quite right, so we can bring the highlights over to more to the midtones, bring the midtones down as well. And we brought some of those highlights back there. Now the tone curve is really, really powerful. I would recommend taking the time, just playing with it, just learning it, how it works, because you can make some really nice edits with the tone curve. It is really, really powerful, and I like to use it in conjunction with the sliders. So what I'll do now is I'll jump into my preset, because I edited this image before, and then I saved the preset of what I did. So I saved it as Priory 2, because it's named after the place it was taken, Priory Gardens, and this is the final edits that I made. So let's have a look and see what I did. So contrast plus 35, and that might be a little bit too much contrast, so in hindsight, so let's bring that down to about plus 15. And if we jump into the white balance, the white balance is it's pretty much as shot, not much has been done to it. You can see the difference the white balance makes to a picture though. If we put it to what auto mode tried to put it to, so if we just swipe, this is the auto mode photo, you can see it selected like a 4,500 Kelvin white balance with a plus 27 tint. So if we mirror that white balance over here, like somewhat, like the image just looks like all wrong. And yeah, so now let's just jump over to the tone curve and see what I've done there. So you can see that I brought up the blacks a little bit. We bring them back down. Just what that does is it gives it like that faded look. You can see the black starts to look a bit faded. This is like a very subtle, what's called an S curve. So just where you make an S shape out of the tone curve. That's a very extreme example just to show you what I mean there. So let's just undo a few of those things. And it just gives you that sort of quite popular, that faded look. So here you can like fade the whites, and here you can fade the blacks. And that's what I do to pretty much all of my pictures with the tone curve. And a bit more advanced, I don't want to go too much into it in this video, is the RGB section of the tone curve. So you can see here, like we can split up the tone curve into just the colors. So red, green and blue. So here we have the reds in the midtones. So we can just like take the reds completely out of the midtones, or just add a load of reds into the midtones and make the forest look nuclear. So, you know, again, however you want your picture to look, there's no right or wrong. I'm not going to come in and tell you, do this to the tone curve to achieve like this look, because like it is entirely up to you. So I kind of took some of the greens out of the midtones, and with the blues, just kind of did the same thing. Again, it's like, it's just seeing what works, just experimenting and playing around. There's no like one size fits all. Like I can't tell you, shoot at these settings, make these edits, because all depends on where you are, what sort of picture you're taking, and again what sort of look you're going for. You might edit and shoot this picture completely differently to me. This is just what I do, so don't be like, you edited it wrong, and I'll be like, well, I edited it how I like it. So I admit my edits don't make perfect sense. Like I brought the shadows up on the sliders, but I also brought the shadows down on the tone curve. Like contradictory, yes. Do I care? Not really. I like the picture. And that's just how I like to edit. So this is quite an extreme example. If we hold the picture, tap and hold, you can see the original, and here is the edit. Not all pictures need this sort of extreme before and after. The reason I shoot like shadow heavy, especially in these forest situations where there is highlights coming through the trees, it's just to protect those highlights. If you don't, like this is what happens. This is the auto mode picture, and it's exposed for the forest, it's exposed for like these sort of areas, and that's good. I can see exactly why it's done that, because it's taken an overall light reading, if you like, of the image, saw that these were the predominant tones in the image and tried to expose for them the best, but it has completely neglected the highlights. Now this being a raw file, like we could just like whack the highlights down 100 and the exposure down. So we can rescue these highlights a little bit, but they don't look the best, you can see. This is why I shoot in full manual mode, just because I can't trust the auto mode to do exactly what I want it to do. The auto mode doesn't have any idea what sort of look I'm going for, like it doesn't have any idea what sort of edits that I'm going to want to make later. It's just doing what it thinks best. So I can't blame it for that. I'm not criticizing it really. It's just, it's not for me. If you like auto mode and it works for you, by all means go for it, but I prefer full manual mode. But let's look at a less extreme example. When I'm not shooting to protect the highlights, I'm just looking for a good overall exposure. The before and after looks more like this. So this is the before and this is the after. If we look at what I actually did, you can see like shadows plus 51 looks quite high still, but the change is subtle. It looks like this. So this is the before, like at 0, and then this is plus 51. So it's not a massive change. And you can see I actually raised the highlights plus 33. You don't always have to do like this to your picture, like bring the highlights way down and the shadows way up. I mean, the picture does look okay. It has that sort of surreal HDR look that I see quite a lot. So here I want to draw attention to this like sculpture on the beach, and I liked the kind of fluffy, dreamy, blown out cloud look. And the tone curve looks suspiciously similar to my last tone curve. Like again, I edit pretty much the same way. Shoot to edit, as they say. Like I'm selecting my settings based on what I know is going to work with my style of editing and what I like. So one final example of some more subtle edits is this image here. So this is the before and this is the after. Now most of the image, most of the edits here pertain to the colors. My main goal with this image is to draw attention to this here, this flower plant thing, which I don't know what it's called. So I wanted to do that by just desaturating the greens. Here, the flower thing looks like it's on the same level. It looks like it's been absorbed by the greens. But here, it really looks like it's standing out against them. So that's just an example of not every raw file needs to go like +1, +2 on the exposure. And that's it. That's how to get started shooting in RAW and get the photos that you want. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, if you've learned something, if you found it valuable, found it useful, then please let me know in the comments below. And at the same time, if you think that the way I shoot is completely wrong, if you think I'm a complete idiot, if if you don't like the way I edit my photos, then please let me know. Please share your ideas, because I like to learn too, you know. Next up, I have a review of Pro Camera, and then at that point I think I've pretty much covered all of the main advanced camera apps. And I've had a lot of requests to look at the app Focus, which is spelled Focus or Focus, so I will probably take a look at that one as well. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching, take care, and as always, back around.